Hey everyone, I'm Adam Dede and welcome to Neurojournal Club. Today we're going to be asking the question, how can we measure states of consciousness? And more generally, we're going to be asking, when we do measure those states of consciousness, do we find that all conscious experiences are kind of fundamentally the same with a change in volume or a change of intensity? Or do we find that there are actually fundamentally different states? So the idea of talking about levels of consciousness is something that's been with us for a while. So here we're looking at a figure from Lindsley, 1957. We're looking at electroencephalogram brainwave traces from people who are in deep sleep, down here at the bottom, all the way up to excited up here at the top. And if you take a look at these bars that are on the side, these bars represent 50 microvolts. The fact that we see those bars getting bigger as we go from deep sleep up to excited implies that the waves are getting smaller and smaller if we have a bigger scale bar. So the big thing to take home from this is that as we go from deep sleep up to excited, we generally see smaller and smaller waves in terms of both amplitude and in terms of period. So we have these really big, really slow waves down in deep sleep, and then by the time we're up at excited, we have really small, really fast waves. And the fact that we can see linear change from big, slow waves to small, fast waves as we move from deep sleep to excited kind of leads to this idea of levels of consciousness, that we're just moving along this continuum in a linear fashion. And this idea was even applied to altered states of consciousness, that it's like just changing the volume, by this guy Moreau in 1845. So he looked at people who had been smoking hashish, taking nitrous oxide, being hallucinated, being put in sensory deprivation, various types of altered states of consciousness being induced in various different ways. But the big conclusion that he came to was that it didn't matter how your altered state of consciousness was induced, they were all fundamentally the same. And this kind of emphasized the idea that it's just like changing the volume. When you move from one state of consciousness to another, it's just a single continuum. It's either intense or it's not intense. You move from coma to mania, and there's just linear changes all the way through it. And this was even applied then by Moreau to altered states, as we just talked about. So drug states, meditative states, hallucinogenic states, doesn't matter, all the same. And we talk about it in our everyday language and cliches with phrases like higher state, the idea that you can meditate or take a drug to reach some kind of a higher state, and the idea of getting high, like when you take a drug, you're going to move to some higher place. But it all seems a little bit lacking, at least to me it does. I don't really like thinking about the idea that there's only one dimension of change in the way that my mind functions. I feel like there's a lot more to it. But still, this guy Dietrich, in 1975, he decided to try and really measure altered states of consciousness, and he moved along the same sort of lines that Moreau had come from, this idea that all altered states are going to be fundamentally the same. So what he did was he got people, he had them, he induced altered states of consciousness in 11 different ways, so various types of drugs, sensory deprivation, sensory overload, hypnosis, lots of different ways that he looked at different states of consciousness. And then he asked people to endorse various statements as true or false. And the statements had a flavor kind of like this. So he'd ask people to endorse, I saw flashing lights in darkness. Everything seemed to unify. Everyday things gained meaning. I experienced awe. I felt profound. I felt like a marionette. I felt threatened. My imagination was vivid. Noises influenced vision. And I felt as if I was floating. So if you've watched the last couple of videos that I've put up about DMT experiences and meditative experiences, you'll kind of feel like these are sort of same to a lot of the types of things that people describe when they're meditating or when they're on DMT. And what Dietrich found when he looked at all of this was that it kind of all boiled down to 3 different primary factors that you could sort these different statements into. And just to let you know, there were a lot more statements than the ones that I've listed here. He had some 70-odd statements. I've just put a small subset up here for you to take a look at. And he found that the 3 main factors that describe changes in people's altered states when they took these drugs or had these different procedures enacted upon them were oceanic boundlessness, and he described this as a mystical experience, a feeling of unity, a feeling of oneness, ego dissolution, dread of ego dissolution. So this was paranoia, anxiety, loss of cognitive control, fear, things that you might think of when you think of a bad trip. And then visionary restructuralization. So this was any kind of visual hallucination, changes in the intensity of light, changes in the intensity of color. And all of these things do kind of fit along with the types of things that we've talked about before, especially in the video on DMT about experiences that people have when they're in that kind of a drug state. And then, so Dietrich found back in 1975 that all three of these factors, they tended to move in roughly the same way, regardless of the etiology of the altered state of consciousness. So it didn't matter what drug, didn't matter what method, everybody changed in about the same way. And this really supported Moreau's idea and Lindsley's idea that there's just levels of consciousness, it's all on one continuum, just like changing the volume. So Dietrich's data really fell right in line with that. And here I can show you just a quick figure from Studeros, Gamma, and Vollenwider 2010. And they looked at people who'd taken psilocybin, ketamine, and MDMA. We're looking on the x-axis at oceanic boundlessness, dread of ego dissolution, and visual changes. And what we can see, just as you'd expect from everything that I've told you about Moreau and Dietrich, that there's just this change where you get an increase in OSB, a decrease in DED, and an increase in VIR, and that seems to just happen regardless of which drug people are taking. Now, it didn't end here, because Studeros, Gamma, and Vollenwider, they felt kind of unsatisfied with this result in the same way that I feel kind of unsatisfied with this result. Like, is it really the same thing to take all three of these different drugs? Is it really the same thing to have psychosis as it is to be in sensory deprivation? Are all these changes in altered states of consciousness, are they really all the same thing? So Studeros, Gamma, and Vollenwider, what they did was they applied some modern statistics to look and see, can we really sort out all of Dietrich's questions into just these three simple factors? And what they found was that no, you really couldn't. The problem was that the factors weren't really independent. So really, especially the visual changes and the oceanic boundlessness, they had such a strong correlation across many of the items that went into those factors that they weren't really independent. And when they started to try and ask the question, okay, what are the factors that we can create if we try and create independent factors? What they found was that they actually needed to split it out into 11 different factors. So what are the factors that they found? Unity experience, spiritual changes, blissful state, a feeling of insightfulness, a feeling of disembodiment, a feeling that you've lost control, anxiety, visuals A, so this is simple visual changes, so just changes in the intensity of color, that kind of thing. Visuals B, so this is complex visual changes, so this is like patterns, moving things, shapes, that kind of thing. Synesthesia, so the overlap between different sensory modalities, and then meaning changes. So when you see a chair, does the chair suddenly have a whole lot more meaning in it than it did when you were sober? And now, when they split this stuff out, now keep in mind, this is still Dietrich's set of questions. This is exactly the same type of data that Dietrich was working with, but they've just done some different statistics on it and split it out in a different way. And now we can see some really marked differences between these three different drugs. So MDMA, we can see, causes a higher blissful state than either of the other two drugs. And then by contrast, we can see ketamine really causes a sense of disembodiment relative to these other two drugs. And then we can see that MDMA relative to the other two doesn't really do much in the way of visuals or synesthesia. So MDMA is really, it seems, more about the feelings, the blissful state, and less about the perception, whereas psilocybin and ketamine seem to be causing more perceptual change and less in terms of the feeling change. So something is going on here where different drugs are able to move people into different states of consciousness. So what can we conclude from that? So it's not just a volume change. Factors shift independently. So this leads us to the idea that there's multidimensional consciousness. Consciousness doesn't just move from coma to mania, it has all kinds of different directions that it can move in, which is super exciting. It means that there's different ways that you can be, different types of being that are possible. Now, some limitations and questions. So, do the Dietrich survey questions cover everything? So keep in mind that Dietrich was really strongly influenced by Moreau, this idea that there was only a single type of altered state. And he may have designed his survey questions in a way that kind of fell out for him more easily. Now, even though in the analysis that we looked at here, new types of statistical methods are able to actually pull out some differences, might there be even more differences lurking if we could design a better survey? How might other states appear on this scale? So here we just looked at 3 different drug states. How might states of sensory deprivation, meditation, all different manner of altered states of consciousness, how are they going to appear on this scale? That'd be an interesting thing to take a look at. And then how does the state of consciousness interact with the content? So here we're looking very much at just the state of consciousness, and most of that is assessed subjectively. But how does that interact with the content of consciousness? So what information actually makes it into your conscious processing? And it's likely to be the case that this changes quite a bit depending on the state of consciousness that one might find themselves in. So that's the video for today. Hope you liked it. Please click the thumbs up. Please subscribe. And if you're feeling it, click the Patreon link down below to support me. Thanks. Have a good one.